On a quiet stretch of an empty country road, a sleek black SUV sat motionless, its driver stranded under the scorching sun. Ethan Castillo, a man who seemed to have it all, success, wealth, influence, found himself utterly powerless. A shredded tire, no phone signal, and miles of isolation. But what happened next was something no one could predict. A boy, no older than 14, appeared out of nowhere, stepping into Ethan's life with a mix of kindness and confidence. Who was he? And why was he so willing to help without asking for anything in return? Little did Ethan know, this brief encounter wasn't just about fixing a flat tire. It was the start of a journey that would challenge everything he thought he understood about success, gratitude, and the connections that truly matter. Before we begin, let us know where you're watching this story from. Is it cold there? Brew yourself a warm cup of tea and gather with your loved ones to enjoy today's story together. Don't forget to hit subscribe to enjoy more amazing stories. The sun blazed relentlessly over the narrow country road, casting shimmering waves across the asphalt. Ethan Castillo, a polished executive in his mid-40s, gripped the steering wheel of his sleek, black SUV. He glanced at the dashboard clock with a frown. Time was slipping away, and he couldn't afford to be late for the merger meeting that could solidify his company's dominance in the market. The road stretched endlessly ahead, flanked by golden fields and patches of dense forest. It was picturesque, but Ethan barely noticed. His mind was fixated on the presentation slides and profit projections that awaited him in the city. Suddenly, a sharp jolt rattled the SUV, followed by a rhythmic thudding sound. The vehicle swerved slightly as Ethan hit the brakes, pulling to the side of the road. He stepped out into the sweltering heat, muttering under his breath. The smell of heated rubber hit his nostrils as he crouched beside the rear wheel. The tire was utterly ruined, shredded and deflated, with jagged pieces of rubber clinging to the rim. "Perfect," he muttered, loosening his tie and surveying the empty road. No other cars in sight, no sign of help. He reached into his pocket and retrieved his phone, but a glance at the screen made his stomach sink. No signal. Ethan leaned against the SUV, wiping his brow with a silk handkerchief. He wasn't used to this kind of inconvenience. Back in the city, assistance and services handled everything, from minor inconveniences to major crises. Here, on this desolate stretch of road, he felt utterly helpless. His frustration bubbled over as he opened the trunk to search for the spare tire. He found it, along with the tools he assumed were for changing a tire. He stared at the jack and wrench as if they were artifacts from an ancient civilization, completely foreign to him. As he stood there, debating whether to attempt the repair or wait for a miracle, a distant figure appeared on the horizon. Squinting against the sun, Ethan could make out a boy walking toward him. He was perhaps 13 or 14, wearing a worn t-shirt and faded jeans. The boy's pace was brisk, his steps purposeful, and his expression curious but confident. "Hey, mister, need some help?" the boy called out, stopping a few steps away from the SUV. Ethan hesitated. He wasn't used to relying on strangers, let alone a kid, for assistance. "Flat tire," he said curtly. "I was just about to handle it." The boy grinned, his face lighting up with a mixture of amusement and kindness. "Doesn't look like you've got much practice with this sort of thing," he said. "Mind if I take a look?" Ethan felt a pang of irritation, but also a strange sense of relief. "Be my guest." The boy knelt by the wheel, inspecting the damage with a practiced eye. "You've got a spare, right?" he asked, glancing up. Ethan nodded, gesturing to the trunk. The boy went to work with a confidence that surprised Ethan. He retrieved the tools and the spare, positioning the jack under the car with precision. "What's your name?" Ethan asked after a moment of silence. "Lucas," the boy replied without looking up. "My dad taught me how to do this. Said you never know when you'll need to help someone out." Ethan watched as Lucas loosened the lug nuts with ease. His movements were efficient, almost professional. Ethan felt a twinge of embarrassment at his own ineptitude. "You do this often?" Ethan asked, his tone wavering between curiosity and disbelief. "Sometimes," Lucas said with a shrug. "Not everyone has roadside assistance, you know?" Within minutes, Lucas had removed the damaged tire, replaced it with the spare, and tightened the bolts securely. He wiped his hands on his jeans and stepped back, giving Ethan a thumbs up. "All set, mister." Ethan blinked, genuinely impressed. He reached into his wallet and pulled out a crisp $100 bill, extending it toward Lucas. "Here, for your trouble." Lucas shook his head firmly, stepping back. "I didn't do it for money," he said. "Just glad I could help." Ethan frowned, holding the bill out insistently. "Take it. You've earned it." Lucas smiled, a warm, genuine smile that caught Ethan off guard. "Really, mister, it's fine. You look like you could use a hand. That's all." Before Ethan could protest further, Lucas waved and began walking back down the road, the same way he had come. Ethan stood there, the bill still in his hand, watching as the boy's silhouette grew smaller and smaller. As Ethan climbed back into his SUV and started the engine, he glanced at the rearview mirror, half expecting to see Lucas again. But the road behind him was empty. He gripped the steering wheel, his thoughts swirling. He wasn't used to kindness without strings attached. The encounter left him unsettled in a way he couldn't quite explain. As the SUV rolled back onto the road, Ethan found himself replaying the moment in his mind. The boy's confident smile, his refusal of payment, and the ease with which he handled the situation. It was a stark contrast to the world Ethan was used to, where every action had a motive and nothing came for free. By the time he reached the city, the minutes he had lost no longer seemed to matter. Something about Lucas's act of kindness had pierced through the layers of cynicism Ethan had built around himself. It wasn't just about a flat tire. It was about a connection, however brief, that had left an imprint on him. Ethan didn't know it yet, but this simple encounter was about to change his life in ways he could never have imagined. The hum of the engine filled the silence as Ethan drove down the highway, the city skyline gradually coming into view. Yet his thoughts were far from the towering buildings and the important meeting he was now late for. His mind replayed the brief yet profound encounter with Lucas, the boy's calm demeanor, the effortless way he handled the flat tire, and most of all, his refusal to accept payment. Ethan tapped his fingers against the steering wheel, his chest tight with an inexplicable emotion. He was used to transactions, to giving and receiving with clear expectations. But Lucas had upended that dynamic entirely, leaving Ethan feeling both unsettled and humbled. Why had the boy refused the money? It wasn't just unusual, it was foreign to everything Ethan knew about the world. People didn't act selflessly, especially not for strangers. There was always a catch, a hidden motive. That was the foundation upon which Ethan had built his career. Yet Lucas had walked away, smiling as though helping was its own reward. The city streets were busy as Ethan maneuvered his SUV toward his office. Horns blared, pedestrians hurried across crosswalks, and the chaos of urban life surrounded him. But Ethan felt disconnected from it all, as if he were moving through a haze. Even as he stepped into the sleek glass building where his company occupied several floors, the usual buzz of office activity failed to ground him. "Mr. Castillo," his assistant called out as he entered the boardroom. "We've rescheduled the presentation for this afternoon." Ethan nodded absently, his mind still elsewhere. He took his seat at the head of the long, polished table, staring at the stack of documents in front of him. Normally, he would be laser-focused, but today he couldn't shake the image of Lucas waving goodbye, the boy's genuine smile lingering in his mind. The hours passed in a blur. Ethan completed his presentation, answered questions, and nodded along to discussions, but his heart wasn't in it. By the time he left the office, the sun was sinking below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. The drive home felt heavier than usual, as if the weight of his thoughts had seeped into his very being. When he pulled into the driveway of his modern suburban home, the automatic gates slid open with their usual efficiency. The house, with its sharp angles and pristine exterior, stood as a testament to his success. But tonight, it felt cold, almost sterile. Ethan stepped inside, greeted by the soft hum of classical music playing in the background. Lauren, his wife, looked up from the dining room, her warm brown eyes narrowing slightly as she took in his expression. "You're late," she said, her tone light but curious. "Long day," Ethan replied, loosening his tie and setting his briefcase by the door. Lauren studied him for a moment, her brow furrowing. "Something's on your mind. What is it?" Ethan hesitated, unsure how to explain the strange mix of emotions swirling within him. "Just something happened on my way to the meeting." Nina tilted her head, gesturing for him to join her at the table. "Dinner's almost ready, but you can tell me about it now." Ethan sat down, rubbing his temples as he searched for the right words. "I had a flat tire out on that old country road. No signal, no help in sight. I was stuck." "And?" Lauren prompted, her tone soft but insistent. "This boy came along, maybe 14 years old. He just walked up and offered to help. Changed the tire in no time, like it was the most natural thing in the world." Ethan paused, his voice growing quieter. He refused to take any money for it, just smiled and walked away. Lauren raised her eyebrows, a small smile tugging at her lips. "That's incredible. You don't see that kind of kindness every day." Ethan nodded slowly. "That's the thing. I don't understand it. Why would someone do that? Just help, without expecting anything in return?" Lauren's smile faded, replaced by a thoughtful expression. "Maybe he didn't need a reason. Maybe that's just who he is." Ethan leaned back in his chair, his gaze distant. "It made me feel strange, like I've been missing something." Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of footsteps. Their two children, Emma and Jonah, appeared in the doorway, chattering about their day. Lauren waved them over. "Come on, dinner's ready." As the family gathered around the table, the usual din of conversation filled the room. Emma talked excitedly about her upcoming school project, while Jonah recounted his latest soccer practice. Ethan, however, was quieter than usual, his thoughts still lingering on Lucas. Lauren noticed and gave him a gentle nudge. "Why don't you tell the kids about your flat tire?" Ethan hesitated, then relented. "I was on my way to work this morning when my tire blew out. I couldn't fix it, but this boy came along and helped me." Emma looked up from her plate, curious. "How old was he?" "About your age," Ethan replied, glancing at her. 14, maybe 15. Jonah frowned. "Did you pay him?" Ethan shook his head. He wouldn't take any money, just said he wanted to help. The room fell silent for a moment as Emma and Jonah processed this. Finally, Jonah shrugged. "Maybe he's just a good person." Emma nodded thoughtfully. "It's nice to know there are people like that out there." Ethan smiled faintly, but the knot in his chest tightened. His children spoke of kindness so easily, as if it were natural. Yet for him, it felt alien, something he couldn't quite grasp. As the evening wore on, Lauren watched her husband closely. After the kids had gone to bed, she joined him on the couch, placing a hand on his arm. "Ethan," she said softly, "why does this bother you so much?" He sighed, rubbing his face. "I don't know. Maybe because it reminded me of something I lost a long time ago." Lauren nodded, her expression understanding. Kindness has a way of doing that. It makes us reflect, whether we want to or not. Ethan leaned back, staring at the ceiling. "I can't stop thinking about him, about what it means to just help without expecting anything." Lauren squeezed his hand. "Maybe it's time to find out." Ethan didn't respond, but her words lingered as he went to bed that night. As he stared at the dark ceiling, Lucas's smile haunted him, not as a mystery to be solved, but as a challenge to be met. The morning sun filtered through the tall glass windows of Ethan's kitchen, casting warm streaks of light onto the marble countertops. He sat at the table, absently stirring a cup of coffee that had long gone cold. The thoughts from the previous day lingered, weighing heavier with each passing moment. He had tried to sleep, tried to shake off the encounter with the boy named Lucas, but the boy's genuine kindness gnawed at something deep inside him. Why couldn't he just let it go? He had thanked Lucas. He had offered payment. The encounter was supposed to end there. Yet it hadn't. Lauren entered the kitchen, her expression softening when she saw him. "Up early again?" she asked, pouring herself a cup of tea. Ethan nodded, rubbing the back of his neck. "I'm going back to that road," he said finally. Lauren raised an eyebrow, surprised. "To find the boy?" "Yes," he replied, his voice resolute. "I need to thank him properly, or at least understand why he helped me." Lauren studied him for a moment, then gave a small smile. Maybe you'll find what you're looking for. Ethan left shortly after, driving the same route he had taken the day before. The countryside stretched out in familiar hues of green and gold, the winding road empty save for the occasional bird darting across his path. The stillness was soothing but also unnerving. It left him alone with his thoughts. The spot where his SUV had broken down came into view, the faint outline of the tread marks still visible on the gravel shoulder. He slowed the car, pulling over to the same spot, and stepped out. The heat of the morning sun pressed against his skin as he scanned the area. There was nothing, just the distant hum of cicadas and the rustling of leaves in the breeze. He looked down the road, where Lucas had disappeared the previous day, and decided to follow it on foot. The boy had to live nearby. The walk wasn't long, but it felt endless. Every step seemed to amplify the doubts in Ethan's mind. What if Lucas wasn't home? What if he didn't want to see him? What if this entire idea was foolish? Then he saw it, a small, weathered house set back from the road, surrounded by patches of overgrown grass. A rusty bicycle leaned against the porch railing, and the faint sound of a radio playing a country tune drifted through the open windows. Ethan hesitated for a moment, then walked up the uneven path leading to the front door. He raised his hand to knock, but before he could, the door creaked open. A woman stood there, her hair pulled back into a loose ponytail. She was wearing an apron dusted with flour, and her expression shifted from curiosity to guarded surprise when she saw him. "Can I help you?" she asked, her tone cautious but polite. Ethan cleared his throat. "I'm looking for Lucas. I think this is his house." Her brow furrowed slightly before her face softened in recognition. "You must be the man he helped yesterday," she said, stepping aside and calling over her shoulder. "Lucas, someone's here to see you." Moments later, Lucas appeared, his eyes lighting up with recognition. "Hey, mister," he greeted with a wide grin. "Did you get another flat tire?" Ethan chuckled, shaking his head. No flat tire this time. I wanted to find you, to thank you properly." Lucas tilted his head, confused. "I told you, you don't need to thank me. It wasn't a big deal." Ethan looked at him, then at the woman standing nearby. "It is a big deal. At least, it is to me." The woman folded her arms, her expression softening. "Well, you're here now. Why don't you come in? We don't have much, but I can put on some coffee." Ethan hesitated, then nodded. "Thank you. I'd appreciate that." Inside, the house was modest but full of life. The furniture was old but well kept, and the walls were adorned with faded family photos. The scent of freshly baked bread lingered in the air, mingling with the faint aroma of coffee brewing in the kitchen. Lucas's mother motioned for Ethan to sit at the small wooden table while she poured him a cup of coffee. "I'm Nina, by the way," she said, setting the mug in front of him. "Lucas told me about helping someone yesterday, but I didn't expect you to come looking for him." Ethan took a sip of the coffee, the warmth of it grounding him. It's not every day someone helps a complete stranger and refuses anything in return. I couldn't stop thinking about it. Nina gave a small smile, sitting across from him. "That's just Lucas. He's always been that way, kind, helpful. He's got a good heart." Lucas, who had been leaning against the counter, shrugged sheepishly. "It's not a big deal. My dad always said you should help people when you can." Ethan glanced at the boy, his gaze lingering. "Your dad sounds like a wise man." Nina's smile faltered slightly, and she looked down at her coffee cup. "He was," she said softly, "passed away a few years ago." An awkward silence settled over the room, but Lucas broke it quickly, his tone upbeat. "Mom keeps everything running, though. She's amazing at it." Nina chuckled, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "We do what we can." Ethan looked around the room, taking in the signs of resilience and love woven into every corner. The patched cushions on the sofa, the handmade curtains, the neatly stacked books on the shelf. It was a stark contrast to his own home, with its pristine surfaces and cold, impersonal design. "This is a good home," Ethan said, his voice sincere. Nina nodded, a faint blush creeping into her cheeks. "It's not much, but it's ours." Lucas chimed in with a grin. "It's better now that the roof doesn't leak every time it rains." Ethan smiled, feeling a warmth he hadn't felt in a long time. I'd like to help if that's okay. Nina blinked, taken aback. Help? With what? Ethan gestured around the room. Repairs, renovations, whatever you need. You helped me, and I'd like to return the favor. Nina hesitated, glancing at Lucas, who was watching her intently. After a moment, she nodded slowly. All right, but only if you're sure. I'm sure, Ethan said, a sense of purpose settling over him. And I'd like to get started as soon as possible. Lucas beamed, and Nina's cautious smile grew a little wider. For the first time in a long time, Ethan felt like he was doing something meaningful. Not for his career, not for appearances, but for the simple joy of making a difference. The next morning, Ethan found himself back in his office, surrounded by the hum of city life. Yet, despite the pressing demands of emails, phone calls, and meetings, his mind kept drifting to Lucas and his mother, Nina. Their modest home had left a mark on him, a stark reminder of how little it took to create warmth and connection. The thought stirred something deep within him, a need to do more than just express gratitude. By lunchtime, Ethan had made up his mind. He canceled his remaining meetings, grabbed his keys, and drove out of the city. The 2-hour drive back to Lucas's home felt lighter this time, as if the weight of his thoughts had turned into something tangible, something he could act upon. When he arrived, the sun was high, casting long shadows across the yard. Lucas was out front, tossing a ball against the side of the house. He lit up when he saw Ethan's car pull into the driveway. Hey, mister, Lucas called, running up to greet him. You're back. Ethan stepped out, smiling. I told you I'd come by. Is your mom home? Lucas nodded, gesturing toward the house. She's in the kitchen. Want me to get her? That'd be great. Lucas darted inside, leaving Ethan to take in the house once more. The siding was worn and peeling, and the porch had several loose boards. The roof sagged slightly in one corner, and the yard, though full of life, bore signs of years of wear and tear. Nina's brow furrowed slightly. Mr. Castillo, you don't owe us anything. Lucas helped you because that's just who he is. I know, Ethan said quickly, and I'm not doing this because I feel like I owe you. I'm doing it because I want to. You're home. It's beautiful, but I can see it could use some work. Let me help fix it up. Nina's expression softened, but there was still hesitation in her eyes. That's a kind offer, but we've managed just fine so far. I wouldn't feel right accepting. Please, Ethan interrupted gently. Let me do this. It's not charity. It's a gesture of gratitude. You and Lucas have already given me more than I can put into words. Nina looked at him for a long moment, her eyes searching his. Then she glanced at Lucas, who was watching intently. His hopeful expression seemed to tip the balance. All right, she said finally, but just the essentials. Nothing extravagant. Ethan smiled, relief washing over him. Agreed. Just the essentials. Over the next week, Ethan threw himself into the project with an energy he hadn't felt in years. He called in favors from contacts in construction, assembling a small but skilled crew. When Greg, an old acquaintance and experienced contractor, heard about the situation, he volunteered to lead the renovations. Sounds like a good cause, Greg had said over the phone. Count me in. By the weekend, the crew was ready to start. Ethan arrived early that Saturday morning, his SUV loaded with supplies. The workers had already begun assessing the house, making notes on what needed immediate attention. Lucas was the first to greet him, bounding out of the house with excitement. You brought a whole team, mister. Are they going to fix the roof? Ethan chuckled, ruffling the boy's hair. They're going to fix everything, and you can help if you want. Lucas's eyes lit up. Really? What can I do? We'll find something for you, Greg said, stepping out of his truck with a toolbox in hand. You can be our assistant. Think you're up for it? Yes, sir, Lucas said with a grin. Nina appeared in the doorway, her arms crossed but her smile warm. You didn't waste any time, did you? Ethan shrugged, trying to appear nonchalant. Figured we'd get started before the next rainstorm hits. Nina shook her head, but there was a hint of amusement in her voice. Well, thank you. It means a lot to us. The crew quickly got to work, starting with the roof. The sound of hammers and drills filled the air as the old shingles were stripped away and replaced with sturdy new ones. Inside, workers patched holes in the walls and inspected the plumbing, which had been causing issues for years. Ethan didn't just supervise. He rolled up his sleeves and pitched in. He held ladders, carried supplies, and even helped measure and cut boards under Greg's guidance. His hands, unused to manual labor, ached by the end of the day, but it was a good kind of ache. A reminder that he was doing something real, something meaningful. Lucas was everywhere, eagerly helping the workers. He carried tools, swept up sawdust, and even climbed onto the roof under Greg's watchful eye. His enthusiasm was contagious, spreading through the crew like wildfire. By the time the sun began to set, the team had made significant progress. The roof was nearly finished, and the plumbing repairs were well underway. The house already looked sturdier, as if it were starting to regain its former strength. Ethan stood in the yard, watching as the workers packed up their tools for the day. Lucas ran up to him, his face flushed with excitement. "Are you coming back tomorrow, mister?" he asked. Ethan smiled, resting a hand on the boy's shoulder. "Of course. We've still got a lot to do." Nina approached, her gaze soft but serious. "Thank you, Mr. Castillo, for everything." Ethan met her eyes, his voice quiet but firm. "It's not just for you. It's for me too. I think I needed this more than I realized." Nina nodded, understanding in her expression. "Well, you've made a difference here already, and I think Lucas is learning a lot from you." Ethan glanced at the boy, who was now chatting animatedly with Greg. He felt a warmth in his chest that he hadn't felt in years, a sense of purpose that went beyond his career or material success. As he drove home that evening, the house receding in his rearview mirror, Ethan couldn't help but smile. This was just the beginning, and for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was exactly where he was meant to be. The mornings at Lucas's house had begun to feel familiar to Ethan. The sound of birds chirping in the nearby trees, the laughter of Lucas as he worked alongside the crew, and the scent of fresh coffee brewing in Nina's modest kitchen. All of it seemed to wrap around him like a warm blanket, something he hadn't realized he was missing in his life. It had been a week since the renovations began, and the house was already transforming. The roof no longer sagged, the plumbing had been repaired, and the interior walls were being patched and painted. Each change brought visible joy to Nina and Lucas, and with every passing day, Ethan felt his connection to them grow deeper. On a crisp Thursday morning, Ethan arrived earlier than usual. As he stepped out of his SUV, he saw Lucas crouched near the front yard, his face lit with concentration as he attempted to fix a loose wheel on his rusty bicycle. "Need a hand there, partner?" Ethan asked, walking over. Lucas looked up, his face breaking into a grin. "Morning, mister." "Nah, I think I've got it. Just needs a little tightening." Ethan crouched beside him, watching the boy work. "You know, you remind me of myself when I was your age. I used to tinker with things too, always trying to fix something." Lucas glanced at him curiously. "You did? What happened?" Ethan hesitated, caught off guard by the question. "I guess life got busy. Other things took over." Lucas shrugged, his expression thoughtful. "You can still fix stuff now, though. You've been helping us, haven't you?" Ethan smiled at the boy's innocence. "Yeah, I suppose I am." Inside the house, Nina was in the kitchen preparing breakfast. The crew hadn't arrived yet, and she seemed to relish the quiet moment before the day's chaos began. When Ethan stepped into the room, the scent of sizzling eggs and buttered toast greeted him. "Morning, Mr. Castillo," Nina said with a warm smile. "You're here early." "Call me Ethan," he replied, sitting at the small wooden table. "And yeah, I couldn't wait to see how things were shaping up." Nina chuckled, setting a plate of eggs and toast in front of him. "Well, it's coming together, thanks to you." As they ate, Nina shared stories about her life with Lucas, how he had always been resourceful and kind, even as a young child. She spoke of her late husband, a hard-working man who had taught Lucas everything he knew about fixing things. There was a wistfulness in her voice, but also a quiet strength that Ethan couldn't help but admire. "You've done an incredible job raising him," Ethan said, sincerity in his voice. "He's a great kid." Nina looked down at her plate, her cheeks tinged with color. We manage. The sight of them made him pause in the doorway, an unfamiliar longing tugging at him. Hey, he said, stepping inside. What's everyone up to? Emma barely looked up, and Jonah mumbled something about his game. Lauren, however, set her book aside and smiled. Long day at the site? Ethan nodded, sitting down beside her. Yeah, but it's good. Really good. She raised an eyebrow, intrigued. You've been spending a lot of time there lately. Ethan hesitated, then said, I think it's because it feels real, you know? Helping Lucas and Nina. It's different from what I'm used to. It's meaningful. Lauren's expression softened. I can see that it's been good for you. You seem lighter somehow. Ethan smiled faintly, but his thoughts drifted back to his children. Do you think I've been too distant with the kids? Lauren blinked, surprised by the question. You've always been busy, Ethan, but it's never too late to change that. The following weekend, Ethan made a point of involving his family. He invited them to join him at Lucas's house, and though Emma was skeptical and Jonah initially complained, they eventually agreed. When they arrived, Lucas was ecstatic to meet Ethan's kids. Jonah quickly warmed up, joining Lucas in carrying tools and exploring the yard. Even Emma, despite her initial aloofness, found herself laughing as Lucas teased her about her reluctance to get her hands dirty. Watching them interact, Ethan felt a surge of gratitude. His family was connecting, not just with Lucas and Nina, but with each other in a way they hadn't in years. Nina, watching from the porch, leaned over to Ethan. Your kids are great, she said. You must be proud. Ethan nodded, his throat tight. I am, and I think I have you and Lucas to thank for reminding me of what matters. That evening, as they drove home, the car was filled with a warmth Ethan hadn't felt in a long time. Emma and Jonah chattered about their day, and Lauren rested her hand on his, giving it a gentle squeeze. Today was nice, she said softly. We should do things like this more often. Ethan glanced at her, then at his children in the rearview mirror. For a man accustomed to sleek office spaces and corporate negotiations, the physical labor was a welcome change. By now, Ethan had mastered basic tasks, holding beams steady, measuring planks, even hammering nails with a decent level of precision. His hands were rougher, his back ached more than he cared to admit, but the satisfaction he felt at the end of each day was unlike anything he'd experienced in years. Hey, Mr. Castillo. Greg, the lead contractor, called from atop the scaffolding. You ready to tackle this side of the roof? Ethan grinned, shielding his eyes from the sun. Just tell me where you need me. Greg chuckled. Didn't think I'd see the day a man in a suit would trade his tie for a tool belt. Ethan climbed the ladder, feeling more confident than he had when he first started. As he secured the new shingles in place, he couldn't help but glance down at Lucas, who was enthusiastically helping another worker clear debris from the yard. The boy's energy and determination never seemed to waver, and his laughter rang out across the property. During a water break later that afternoon, Ethan found Lucas sitting under the shade of a large oak tree, sipping lemonade from a plastic cup. Ethan joined him, wiping the sweat from his brow as he sat on the grass. You've been working hard, kid, Ethan said, leaning back against the tree trunk. Lucas grinned, his cheeks flushed from the heat. It's fun. I like helping. Ethan smiled. I've noticed. You're always the first one to jump in. Why's that? Lucas hesitated for a moment, then shrugged. I guess it's just what I've always done. My dad used to say that even if you don't have a lot, you can always give your time or your effort. He said it's what makes life better, for everyone. Ethan's chest tightened at the boy's words. He had spent so much of his life focused on accumulating wealth and status, yet here was Lucas, finding purpose in the simple act of helping others. What about you? Ethan asked, his voice softer. What do you want to do when you grow up? Lucas looked down at his lemonade, tracing the rim of the cup with his finger. I don't know exactly, he admitted, but I want to help people. Maybe fix things, like houses or cars. Or maybe be a teacher. Something that makes a difference. Ethan nodded, impressed by the boy's earnestness. That's a good dream, Lucas. The walls were freshly painted, the plumbing was fully functional, and the floors were reinforced and polished. Lucas had even convinced Ethan to help build a small wooden bench for the porch, a project that had left both of them covered in sawdust but grinning like children. Nina watched from the sidelines, her gratitude evident in the way she smiled whenever she saw Ethan and Lucas working together. One evening, as the crew wrapped up for the day, she approached Ethan with a tray of lemonade and cookies. "You've been working harder than anyone, Mr. Castillo," she said, handing him a glass. "You didn't have to do all this yourself." Ethan took the glass, his hands still dusty from the day's labor. "I wanted to. And please, call me Ethan." Nina hesitated, then nodded. "All right, Ethan. But seriously, you've done so much for us. Lucas talks about you all the time. He looks up to you." Ethan's throat tightened again, but he managed to smile. "He's a good kid. It's hard not to admire him." Nina's gaze softened. "You've brought something back into our lives that we thought we'd lost, hope. And I think you found something here too." Ethan nodded, unable to put into words the depth of what he felt. She was right. He had found something here, something he hadn't even realized he was searching for. That night, as he drove home, the city lights glittering in the distance, Ethan reflected on how far they'd come. This wasn't just about repairing a house. It was about creating a foundation for something greater. Lucas's dreams, Nina's resilience, and the warmth they shared had reignited a fire in him that had long been dormant. He pulled into his driveway, stepping out of the car and staring up at his sleek, modern home. For the first time, it felt less like a fortress and more like a place waiting to be filled with the same kind of warmth he had found at Lucas's house. Ethan knew that this journey wasn't just about helping Lucas and Nina. It was about rebuilding himself, one act of kindness at a time. The final days of renovation brought a mix of exhaustion and excitement to the air. Workers moved in and out of the house, carrying tools, beams, and freshly painted shutters. The yard buzzed with activity as every creak, leak, and crack of the old house was replaced with something sturdy and new. Ethan stood on the porch, hands on his hips, watching as Greg and his crew added the finishing touches. For the first time, the house looked like it belonged in the future rather than a forgotten past. The siding gleamed with a fresh coat of paint, the windows sparkled, and the roof, now solid and straight, gave the house a proud, dignified appearance. Inside, the transformation was even more profound. The once uneven floors had been polished to a warm sheen. The kitchen had new countertops, and the walls bore cheerful colors chosen by Nina and Lucas. Each room was a testament to the love and care that had gone into the project, a labor of more than just construction but of connection. "Ready to see your new room?" Ethan asked Lucas, who was practically bouncing with excitement in the hallway. "Are you kidding? I've been ready for days." Lucas grinned, his face lighting up like the morning sun. Ethan opened the door with a flourish, revealing the space that had been lovingly crafted for the boy. It was modest but warm, a place that radiated comfort and belonging. The walls were painted a soft sky blue, adorned with posters of planes and bicycles that Lucas had chosen. A sturdy wooden bed with bright green bedding sat against the far wall, and a small desk with shelves rested near the window. Lucas's jaw dropped. This is mine," he whispered, as though speaking louder might shatter the moment. Ethan nodded, a smile tugging at his lips. "All yours, kid." Lucas dashed inside, running his hands over the desk, the bed, the new bookshelves. "It doesn't leak when it rains, and the floor doesn't creak when you walk on it," he said, spinning around with a grin. "It's perfect." Nina, who had been watching from the doorway, wiped a tear from her cheek. "Ethan, I don't even know what to say," she said softly. "You don't have to say anything," Ethan replied, his voice warm. "Just seeing you both happy is enough." Later that evening, as the workers packed up for the final time, the house glowed with the golden light of the setting sun. The yard, once cluttered with tools and debris, was now a peaceful space, dotted with freshly planted flowers courtesy of Nina's careful hands. Nina stood on the porch, her arms wrapped around herself as she took it all in. "I can't believe this is our home," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "It doesn't feel real." "It's real," Ethan said, stepping up beside her. "And it's yours." Lucas joined them, his face flushed from running laps around the house with excitement. Mom, did you see the kitchen? And my room? It's like living in a dream. Nina laughed, pulling him close. I saw, sweetheart. And I think you're right. It's like a dream. Ethan watched them, feeling a warmth in his chest that was still unfamiliar but welcome. This wasn't just a house anymore. It was a home. And it wasn't just for them. Somehow, it had become a part of him too. Before I go, Ethan said, reaching into his pocket, I have one more thing. Nina and Lucas turned to him, curious. Ethan pulled out a crisp envelope and handed it to Nina. I wanted to make sure you two have everything you need, not just today, but for the future. Nina hesitated, her brows knitting in confusion as she opened the envelope. Inside were neatly folded documents. Her eyes widened as she scanned the first page, her hand flying to her mouth. Ethan, she whispered, her voice trembling. What is this? Lucas peered over her shoulder, his eyes going wide. A trust fund? For me? Ethan nodded, his tone steady but kind. It's for Lucas's education, or anything else he might need as he grows. I know this project was about fixing the house, but I wanted to give you more than just bricks and paint. I wanted to give you a chance for something bigger. Nina shook her head, tears spilling freely now. Ethan, we can't accept this. It's too much. It's not too much, Ethan insisted gently. It's what you and Lucas deserve. He's a bright kid with so much potential. This is my way of helping him reach it. Lucas stepped forward, his voice trembling. You really did this for me? Ethan crouched to meet his eyes, resting a hand on the boy's shoulder. I did. You taught me something, Lucas, something I'd forgotten. This is just my way of saying thank you. Lucas flung his arms around Ethan, hugging him tightly. Thank you, he whispered. Thank you so much. Ethan returned the hug, his throat tightening. You're welcome, kid. That night, as Ethan drove back to the city, he felt a profound sense of peace. The house had been transformed, but so had he. In helping Nina and Lucas, he had found something he hadn't realized he was searching for. A sense of purpose, of belonging, and of connection. The city lights glittered in the distance, but for once, they didn't feel like a beacon calling him back to work. Instead, they were just lights, background to the real story that was unfolding in his life. As he pulled into his driveway, Ethan thought about what Nina had said earlier, about the house feeling like a dream. He realized that in some ways it was a dream, not just for them, but for him too. And it was only the beginning. The sun was setting behind the trees, casting a warm amber glow over Lucas's newly renovated house. The crisp evening air was filled with the mingling scents of freshly baked bread, grilled vegetables, and spiced meats. Tables and chairs had been set up in the front yard, draped with colorful cloths and surrounded by laughter and chatter. Ethan stood near the porch, watching his neighbors carry trays of food, pitchers of lemonade, and baskets of fruit into the yard. Children ran around, giggling and playing tag, while adults mingled, exchanging stories about the old house that had stood as a landmark in their small community for decades. Lucas ran up to Ethan, a wide grin on his face. Mister, did you see Mrs. Higgins brought her famous apple pie? You've got to try it. It's the best. Ethan laughed, ruffling the boy's hair. I'll take your word for it, but I'll definitely give it a taste. Lucas darted off again, weaving through the crowd with the boundless energy that seemed to define him. Ethan shook his head, smiling to himself as he turned back toward the porch, where Nina stood with a group of neighbors. She was radiant, her smile brighter than he'd ever seen, as she accepted hugs and handshakes from friends who admired the transformation of her home. As the evening settled in, the yard filled with the sounds of clinking glasses, hearty laughter, and the strumming of a guitar from an impromptu musician. Greg, the lead contractor, had brought his instrument, and now a small group was gathered around him, singing along to familiar folk tunes. Ethan found himself seated at one of the tables, surrounded by neighbors eager to share their gratitude. You've done something incredible here, said an elderly man named Mr. Carter, his weathered hands gripping a steaming mug of cider. This house has always been a part of our neighborhood, but it hasn't looked this good in years. Ethan nodded, humbled. It wasn't just me. Nina and Lucas have put so much into this place. It's their spirit that made it a home. Across the table, Mrs. Higgins chimed in. Well, you gave them the boost they needed, and that's something special. Not many people would go out of their way like you did. Ethan didn't know how to respond. The praise felt undeserved. After all, hadn't he started this project to ease his own guilt, to repay a debt he couldn't quite articulate? Yet, as he looked around at the faces of the community, he realized it had become more than that. It wasn't just about fixing a house. It was about building something that would last, a sense of connection, of belonging. Later that night, as the festivities wound down, Nina found Ethan sitting on the porch steps, sipping a cup of coffee and watching the stars. She sat beside him, her hands cradling a mug of tea. "You've been quiet tonight," she said softly. Ethan smiled, shaking his head, just taking it all in. "It's amazing to see how much this place means to everyone." Nina nodded, her gaze drifting out to the yard, where Lucas was playing cards with a group of kids at one of the tables. "It's more than just a house to us, it's a fresh start. And that's because of you." Ethan looked down at his coffee, his voice quiet. "I didn't do it alone." Nina reached out, placing a hand on his arm. "You don't give yourself enough credit. You didn't just fix walls and patch a roof. You brought hope back to this family, to me, and to Lucas." Ethan met her gaze, seeing the sincerity in her eyes. "You and Lucas gave me something too," he admitted. "You reminded me of what really matters. I think I needed that more than I realized." Nina smiled, her eyes misting. "You're a part of our family now, Ethan, whether you like it or not." Ethan chuckled, but the words hit him deeply. He had spent so much of his life building walls around himself, focusing on his career, his image, his success. Yet here, in this small community, surrounded by people who lived with warmth and generosity, he felt something he hadn't felt in years: belonging. As the last of the neighbors began to leave, many stopped to shake Ethan's hand or give him a pat on the back. They spoke of his kindness, of how his actions had inspired them. Some even offered to help him if he ever needed anything, a sentiment that caught him off guard. "We take care of our own here, Mrs. Higgins said as she handed him a plate of leftover pie. "And now you're one of us." Ethan stood by the gate as the final car drove away, the night quieting around him. Lucas ran up to him, clutching the deck of cards he'd been using. "Did you have fun, mister?" Lucas asked, his eyes shining with excitement. Ethan knelt to the boy's level, smiling. "I think I had the best night I've had in years." Lucas grinned. "Good. You deserve it." As Ethan prepared to leave, Nina stopped him at the door. "Thank you," she said, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "For everything. You've given us more than you know." Ethan shook his head. "You and Lucas gave me more than I could ever repay. This house, it's not just yours. It's part of something bigger now." Nina nodded, understanding in her expression. "You'll come back, won't you? Lucas would be heartbroken if you didn't." Ethan smiled. "You're not getting rid of me that easily." As he drove away that night, the renovated house growing smaller in his rearview mirror, Ethan felt something new, a profound sense of purpose. He had come to fix a house, but he was leaving with so much more. A connection to a family, a community, and a part of himself he hadn't realized was missing. For the first time in a long time, he felt whole. The morning after the celebration, Ethan returned to Lucas's house, this time without tools or a work crew. The renovations were complete, but he felt compelled to visit, drawn by something deeper than duty. As he pulled into the driveway, he noticed Lucas sitting on the porch steps, flipping through a small, worn notebook. "Morning, mister," Lucas called, jumping to his feet as Ethan stepped out of his SUV. "I thought you were done coming around now that the house is finished." Ethan smiled, shaking his head. "Not a chance. I just wanted to check in and see how you're settling in." Lucas grinned and gestured toward the house. "It's amazing. Mom keeps walking around saying she can't believe it's all real." Ethan's gaze softened. "I'm glad to hear that. You both deserve it." Lucas motioned for him to sit on the steps, and Ethan obliged. "What are you working on there?" Ethan asked, nodding toward the notebook. Oh, this? Lucas held it up, flipping to a page covered in neat handwriting and small sketches. It's kind of a journal. I write down stuff I want to do someday. You know, big ideas. Ethan leaned closer, intrigued. What kind of big ideas? Lucas hesitated, then handed over the notebook. Ethan skimmed the pages, his brows lifting in surprise. Lucas had drawn plans for community centers, shelters, and workshops, places where people could learn new skills or find support during hard times. Each page was filled with detailed notes, his dreams spilling across the paper in careful strokes. I want to help people, Lucas said, his voice steady. Like you helped us. I don't know exactly how yet, but I want to build things that matter, places where people can feel safe and cared for. Ethan was silent for a moment, staring at the pages. He felt a lump rise in his throat, a mixture of pride and awe at the boy's vision. These are incredible, Lucas, he said finally. You've got a heart for this kind of work. Lucas shrugged, his cheeks reddening slightly. I just think everyone deserves a chance, you know? Sometimes people just need a little help to get back on their feet. As they sat together, Ethan found himself reflecting on Lucas's words. He had always thought of success as something personal, a ladder to climb, a goal to achieve. But Lucas saw it differently. For the boy, success wasn't about personal gain. It was about lifting others up. I think you're going to do amazing things, Lucas, Ethan said, handing back the notebook. And I'd like to help you get started. Lucas blinked, startled. Help me? How? Ethan smiled. You've already got the vision. Now you just need the resources to make it happen. And I think I know a few people who can help. Lucas stared at him, wide-eyed. You mean it? I do, Ethan said firmly. You've inspired me, Lucas. More than you realize. That afternoon, Ethan returned to his office in the city, his mind buzzing with ideas. For years, he had poured his energy into building his company, chasing profits and prestige. But Lucas's words had ignited something in him, a spark of possibility that he couldn't ignore. He sat at his desk, staring at the skyline through his office window. The towering buildings seemed less imposing now, less cold. Instead, they felt like opportunities, places where change could begin. Ethan reached for his phone and began making calls. He contacted old colleagues, pitched ideas to potential partners, and laid the groundwork for a new initiative. It wasn't just about Lucas anymore. It was about creating something bigger, something that could ripple outward and touch countless lives. That evening, Ethan shared his thoughts with his family over dinner. Lauren listened intently, her eyes sparkling with pride, while Emma and Jonah asked questions between bites of spaghetti. So, you want to start what? A charity? Emma asked, twirling her fork in her plate. Not just a charity, Ethan explained. I want to create a foundation, something that helps people like Lucas achieve their dreams. Whether it's funding education, building community spaces, or providing mentorship, I want to make a difference. Jonah's face lit up. Can I help? Ethan chuckled. I'd like that, buddy. There's going to be plenty of work to do. Lauren reached over, placing a hand on his arm. This is amazing, Ethan. I've never seen you so passionate about something. Ethan nodded, a quiet determination settling over him. It's time to put what I've built to good use. Lucas showed me that success doesn't mean much if you're not using it to help others. The next week, Ethan invited Nina and Lucas to his office. Lucas's eyes widened as he took in the sleek furniture and floor-to-ceiling windows, but Ethan quickly put him at ease. Today's not about the office, Ethan said, gesturing toward a conference table where several folders were laid out. It's about planning your first project. Lucas blinked, stunned. My project? Ethan smiled. Your ideas, your vision. You tell us what you want to do, and we'll figure out how to make it happen. Nina looked at Ethan, her eyes glistening. You don't have to do all this. I know, Ethan replied, but I want to. You've already given me more than I could ever repay. Lucas sat down, his excitement bubbling over as he flipped open the notebook he had brought with him. Okay, he said, his voice steady but eager. Let's get started. As Lucas began sharing his plans, Ethan listened intently, taking notes and offering suggestions. The boy's enthusiasm was infectious, and soon the room buzzed with the energy of possibility. By the end of the meeting, they had mapped out the first steps for Lucas's dream. A small community workshop where people could learn basic repair skills, how to fix appliances, mend clothing, and even handle minor home repairs. It was a modest start, but one with the potential to grow into something much bigger. As Nina and Lucas left the office, Ethan stood by the window, watching them disappear into the bustling city streets. He felt a sense of pride he hadn't known before, not for a deal closed or a milestone reached, but for the seeds of change he was helping to plant. Lucas's dream had become his own, and as he turned back to his desk, Ethan realized that this was only the beginning.